Xi Jinping stepped down. These words echoed across China over the weekend in a clear referendum against the country's president. The people of China are holding Xi Jinping accountable. They want him to pay for his mistakes in handling COVID-19. The people of China want Xi Jinping to step down. But will he? Tonight in our cover story, we will give you several reasons as to why Xi Jinping should be made to step down. Let's start with what's happening in China. There are unprecedented protests. The people of China have risked prison sentence to come out on the streets and shout anti-Xi slogans. This is a clear sign of their frustration with the current administrations and its policies. Today, Xi Jinping is trying to crack down on protesters. He has deployed forces across Beijing and Shanghai. Videos posted on social media show policemen stopping people, checking their phones for protest-related content. Even their VPN or virtual private network, you see it's illegal in China. The state fears that protesters are using a VPN to communicate and share videos. To some, these clips coming in from China may look like a successful crackdown, but the reality could not be more different. The fact is that the police and protesters are engaged in a cat-and-mouse game. While the police are checking phones, the protesters are sharing tips on how to wipe data off their phones, in case someone gets detained. Communication has mostly moved to Telegram groups and dating apps. That's where protesters are sharing information with the hope to get around the firewall of censorship. Dissent has also moved online. Chinese netizens are spamming online posts by writing the word good multiple times. It's their way of mocking Xi's administration for projecting a false image that all's good with China, when that's clearly not the case. Xi has responded by deploying his online propaganda machinery. The result is this. Searching for protest-related content in China will lead you to pornography. China is desperately scrubbing off all protest-related material from the internet. But here's the thing. How long can Xi Jinping continue this way? How far will he go? Xi Jinping must realize that he can try and crack down on the protests, but he will not be able to contain the people's anger. This fever of dissent is contagious and it is spreading across China. Look at what's happening in Hong Kong. People are risking the security law to protest against Xi Jinping. Some protesters were heard shouting, "Say no to dictatorship." Young men and women stood holding blank papers even as the police officers took down their personal details. What Xi Jinping is facing is a wave of public anger, the kind which has not been seen since Tiananmen protests of 1989. These protests are a referendum against Xi Jinping. It is the people's message to the president that he needs to go. Protest is just one reason why Xi Jinping should be asked to step down, and performance is another. Let me explain. Xi Jinping had claimed personal responsibility for leading the war against COVID-19. He failed. And so did his flagship zero COVID policy. The Chinese president had sworn to put people above everything, the Chinese people. And now, upwards of 30,000 cases are being reported in China daily. Zero COVID is even coming in between emergency response. People are dying. 10 people lost their lives to a building fire in Xinjiang. Relatives say help did not arrive on time because there were too many hurdles on the way. So who should be held accountable for all this mismanagement? The protesters have an answer. They say Xi Jinping must step down. CCP step down. You need to understand where these protesters are coming from. It's Xi who thrived on building a tradition of holding up the mirror to the mightiest. In the past, China has brought into account some of its biggest names. Actor Fan Bingbing had evaded tax. She was detained, held under house arrest and asked to cough up $70 million. And then you have the case of Meng Hongwei, the former Interpol chief. He was accused of taking some $2 million in bribes. Meng was sentenced to 13.5 years in jail. The Communist Party accused him of disregarding the party's principles. But let me ask, don't the CCP's principles also talk about upholding the people's democratic dictatorship and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party? Xi Jinping has compromised both by sticking to his zero-COVID policy. The Chinese president has invited a growing legitimacy crisis for his party, especially after securing a record third term in office. So, what's stopping the party from asking Xi Jinping to step back? Today, the people of China are on the streets asking for both the CCP and Xi Jinping to give up power. Over the weekend, a crowd in Chengdu was heard chanting, "We don't want lifelong rulers, we don't want emperors." Let me remind you, the actor Fan Bingbing evaded $34 million in taxes, but Xi Jinping has jeopardized the world's second largest economy. It's courtesy Xi's draconian COVID policies that the Chinese economy today is suffering. Let me now show you some headlines. Apple is set to lose 6 million iPhone Pros because of what's happening in China. Reuters says that wealthy democracies are trying to cut their reliance on China. So why shouldn't they? While the world is opening up, China is opposing normalcy, and this stance can cost China its title as the world's factory. Take a look. You see, it's not just those living in China, but businesses outside too are fed up of China's zero-COVID policy and the supply chain hiccups that come up. Again, who's to blame here? This one man who has refused to live with the virus. The Wall Street Journal says that Xi is in a bind. He's afraid to open up China because that may encourage more people to come out and protest. Instead, Xi Jinping is punishing protesters. A busload of people were taken away by the police in Shanghai. There are also reports of arrests being made. The world is watching. Many have picked sides.
We support the right of people everywhere to peacefully protest, to make known their views, their concerns, and their frustrations.
Recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests. A challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism. Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist.
Now, Xi Jinping is trying his best to do damage control. Today, the Chinese Health Ministry announced that it is planning to speed up vaccinations. But what use will that be? The Chinese vaccines are just as good as other Chinese products. They barely work. Xi Jinping is also trying to downplay the protests. China is hiding behind the foreign forces tag. National bloggers allege that the protests were fomented by foreign forces. It's a story that's unlikely to find any buyers, because even those who are not protesting know what it is like to live under zero COVID and zero room for free speech. So we are back to the question, why shouldn't Xi Jinping step down? He has ticked every box of a leader who has failed his people. Under Xi, the Chinese economy is suffering. The people are suffering. Even the Chinese diaspora in Australia, the UK and the US are protesting. There is a clear and public referendum against Xi Jinping. And it's high time that China makes Xi pay. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.